Now it is my honor to introduce the recipient of the 2010 Reflections of Hope Award and the 42nd President of the United States of America, President Bill Clinton.
Thank you very much. First, thanks for the wonderful reception when I came in and when I got introduced, and whoever thought of having that saxophone group here. I owe you big time. Chairman Rochelle, thank you very much. Governor and Mrs. Henry, thank you. Mayor Norick, thanks for what you did then and all the days in between. I want to say a special word of thanks to Kathy Keating, and in her absence, Frank. I'll tell you why in just a minute. And Kerry Watkins, thank you for those movies and all the work you have done. I think you have really done a great job at the Memorial and Museum. Thank you. I'd also like to thank Lieutenant Governor Jerry Askins, Attorney General Drew Edmondson, Secretary of State Susan Savage, former Governor David and Rhonda Walters, and former Attorney General Mike and Susan Turpin. I've got a lot of friends in Oklahoma. I've got more friends here than any other state I never carried. Let me also say that, oh, come on, we got to have a little fun tonight. Did you see how ugly that tree was in the beginning? Before I came here, let me say, part of the reason I'm trying to make a few jokes is so I can get through this. I went back to the memorial, and just by myself. I just went back and I took some flowers. And I had never laid any flowers on the chair of Al Witcher, who was on my personal presidential security detail before he came here, because he and his wife thought this would be the finest place in America to raise their children. And so I did it. And the gentleman, yeah, you can clap for yourselves on that. And so I was intent on finding this chair, and I got some help from the gentleman who was there, and he talked to me about the last time I was there, and the other agent whom I'd laid a wreath at her chair, and we talked about what had happened to her family, and then I just turned around and I almost didn't recognize the tree. I thought the tree had had plastic surgery. I've reached the age where about every third living thing I pass has had plastic surgery. And so, I mean, it was so full and so beautiful. And it's a metaphor for all of you. Let me also say one thing seriously. Just before I left to get on the airplane to fly here, I called the person who most wanted to come with me, the Secretary of State, who asked me to give you all her love. She is, I hope by now, landed in Tallinn, Estonia, a place probably most of you have never been, but it's one of the most beautiful cities in the world. And there are whole neighborhoods there with houses built in the 14th century that are still occupied. And in the summertime, this little city of 500,000, which never gave up on its freedom all the years it was part of the Soviet Union. It was the heart and soul of the Baltic states in their drive for eventually throwing off the yoke of communism. Now this town of 500,000, every single day in the summertime, gets 70 huge cruise ships coming into the harbor, because it is such a beautiful, beautiful place. So our NATO colleagues who are involved with us in Afghanistan and in other ways were all supposed to meet there, and Hillary had to go to the meeting. And it was kind of like the ultimate ad-lib deal, because she called me, or I called her right when she was refueling in Madrid, and she said, "Bill, I've never been quite in this place." She said, I said, "Well, are you going?" She said, "Yeah, but the wind has changed on the volcanic ash, and I won't know till I get there whether I can land. So I won't know till I leave here whether she did." But I imagine she did. She seems to find a way. But she said to tell me she would tell all of you that she wishes you well and she would like to be here. I think all of you know this is an honor that I will always cherish, though I confess when I went to the memorial, I found myself wishing still that there had been no occasion to give rise to this honor. I've been thinking a lot about Oklahoma City lately. The stories that Hillary and I heard when we came here and met with the survivors and the families of the victims who were lost. I've been thinking a lot about the incredible dignity and bravery of the leaders and the people of this state in dealing with it, their strength, their calm. The governor, the mayor, Kathy, you were there in every step of the way. I've been thinking a lot about the people that kept going into that building. And when I saw that film for the first time just a couple of days ago, I had just been having a conversation with people about the problems that many of our service people are having with traumatic brain injuries who served in Iraq and Afghanistan. And if, you know, when we look at the building again, you realize that just the front half of it was sheared off. That's a concussive impact. Not because of anything hitting the building except the sheer power of the concussion. And that's what our young people are at risk of when they encounter one of those roadside bombs. Half the time they're not crushed under a car or hit with a piece of metal, but their brains are bumping up against their skulls with the same sort of concussive power. And I thought about all those brave people that kept going back in there over and over again trying to help save lives, and all your first responders, and then the people that came from all over America to help, and just the people that were praying for you. It really is true that even today, anybody who thinks that this country is mostly mean and selfish do themselves a big favor by coming to Oklahoma City. And as I've said many times, you heard it on the film, Oklahoma City changed me. But I want to say something more specific about that tonight. Far as I can determine, the only thing I ever gave as a specific example was that after I met with those people at the memorial service, I have never again referred to federal employees as federal bureaucrats. Not one time in my life. But I'd like to tell you some other things. You know, there's a lot of political turmoil and tension in America before the Oklahoma City incident. And there have been terrible encounters at Ruby Ridge and at Waco, and you can't say that the federal government was blameless in the way a lot of those things were handled. It was a difficult, traumatic time. So then this happened, and by blind accident, the governor of Oklahoma is a conservative Republican I had known since 1964, because we were students at Georgetown together. And for 30 years, we had been fighting about political issues. Georgetown, we had this huge fight about whether our two campuses should merge and have one student government. Momentous issue. Most of them are when compared to something more important. Frank said no, I said yes, he won. But I liked him. I thought he was smart, and I thought he believed what he was saying just as strongly as I believed what I was saying. In Washington, when you get into all that name calling and stuff that goes on, you sometimes forget that. When I saw the pain in his face and Kathy's and the dignity with which they bore their loss, and the way they worked with the mayor and the way everybody was pulling together, I was reminded that I should feel today about people who disagree with me the way I felt about him 30 years ago. That's a gift you gave me. And when I went back to Washington, I still had a bunch of political battles with Newt Gingrich and Dick Armey and Bob Dole. I actually liked them all. We had a lot of fun beating each other's brains out. But there remained, because of you, a place in my mind and heart that those battles could not touch. There was a reminder in my mind that we were all Americans, and nobody's right all the time. There was a reminder in my heart that we're all God's children, given the same gift of life, and destined to give it back in God's good time. When 9/11 happened, and I was a New Yorker then, and my wife was a senator that had to fight to get the help they needed and deal with the horrible health aftermath that the firefighters and others were dealing with. And my daughter, bless her heart, was in Lower Manhattan, just a few blocks from the World Trade Center, and was part of the tens of thousands of people that were just told to walk north. And when they got to Penn Station, people started pouring out of there with another terrorist threat. And then Hillary had to go to New York, to Washington, and work for her Oklahoma City. And Chelsea and I went down to the Victims Information Center and just did what we could to talk to people. I wondered what I should do, and I thought of you. And Bob Dole and I raised enough money to guarantee some help to the spouses and children of every single person killed or disabled on 9/11. And there were a lot of them. And I thank you for that. Oklahoma City reminded us that how we respond to what happens to us determines who we are and shows the world our identity. Oklahoma City changed America because of how you responded. The little children, you remember when Hillary and I had all those kids in the White House? And we were talking to them, and we were helping people all around America find child psychologists to go into schools and talk to the kids. It registered on children every place in America that 19 children were killed here, children just like them, younger than them. I'll tell you something, those children are young adults now. And you should be proud to know that more than those in the next generation, a little older than them, they are more likely to register to vote, more likely to work in elections, and most importantly, more likely to volunteer in their communities or in their country or halfway around the world. They are fundamentally different. And I know it has something to do with the searing experience that they went through as children and how they were taught to deal with it through the power of your example. And I thank you for that. The dogwood Hillary and I planted will be 15 years old day after tomorrow. The one we planted on the White House lawn right before I came down here for the memorial service. Every spring it blossoms now. I love dogwoods. It's the Arkansas state flower. And there's something achingly beautiful about them. They're fragile, but strong and dependable. Kind of like all of you were after this happened. So now every first family that occupies the White House from now till the end of this country's existence will see that dogwood. Every president and first lady or first man or whatever they're going to call the first whatever, they'll tell their children the meaning of that dogwood. And long after we're all gone, the lives of those who were part of Oklahoma City, including those that were lost, will live on through that lesson, just as they'll live on through the memorial and museum here. 14 years ago, I came back, I guess it was 2 weeks ago, 14 years ago, to dedicate the new child care center. And afterward, I went to Edmond, to the University of Central Oklahoma, and gave a talk about this. And by then, I thought I ought to say something more about the efforts that the Congress had made on a purely bipartisan basis. I'm very grateful for it after Oklahoma City to strengthen our capacity to combat terror and to prevent terrorist incidents. And I reported to them that we had prevented more attacks and arrested more confirmed and suspected terrorists than at any previous point in our country's history. But I said to the students there that I was very much afraid that terrorism would be, for their lifetime, what the nuclear threat in the Cold War was for mine growing up. I wish I had been wrong. But what I want to say to you tonight is that as grateful as I am, and it is profound gratitude for the brave soldiers, the intelligence officers, the anonymous federal employees you will never meet who track that terrorist money trail all over the world and break up those chains. They can't do it alone. In the end, the world is too interdependent. We cannot possibly kill, jail, or occupy every actual and potential adversary we have. We have to try, mind you. And the harder we try, the better we do, and the safer we are. But in the end, people who live in every neighborhood in the world have to win the battles of the heart and the mind. And so the final thing I'd like to say is, in the life I live now, I have almost weekly occasion to be grateful for your brothers and sisters in spirit. I'll just tell you a few. I was in Kosovo recently, where I helped to end a horrible ethnic slaughter, not because of me, but because you gave me the authority as president to do it. And I saw these Serbs and Albanians in a country that was 90% Albanian, where they had been a persecuted majority, not minority. And they could have lashed out once they were independent and in power. And instead, I met with the leaders of the Serbian minority in parliament, and they were raving about the Albanian majority because they had just redrawn all the municipal lines to make sure that the minority Serbs had a few more mayor's seats that they could hold so they would feel fully represented in the life of the country. and they had guaranteed representation in the parliament slightly above their proportion to the population. They bent over backwards to include them. They too have responded as you did. The Irish are governed by the two parties now together who were the most militant in the conflict. People who thought they would walk across the street to avoid looking at each other are holding hands and giving their children and grandchildren a brighter future. They too are your brothers and sisters in spirit. Long toward the end of the year, I went back to Israel. And I went to Tel Aviv and to Jerusalem. And it's always very hard for me because I know that if Prime Minister Rabin had not been murdered in 1995, we would have had peace in the Middle East within 3 years, and the whole last decade for the world would have been so much different. But anyway, a great friend of mine who's in his mid-80s and a number of other Americans go over there every year, and they sponsor this big conference on peace. We had all these people there at what's called the Saban Forum. And I was interviewed by a man named Nahum Barnea, who is an Israeli political columnist. And he asked me all these probing questions. He said to me, he said, "You're the eternal optimist. You still think we're going to make peace, don't you?" I looked at him and I said, "Don't you?" He said, "I don't know, but I hope so." And he kept pushing and he kept pushing about how we would do it. Here's the point of this. In 1996, Nahum Barnea's young son was murdered by a terrorist incident in a bus bombing in Jerusalem with a lot of other children. He lost his dearest love. But he got by his hatred to work so that other children wouldn't die. He is your brother in spirit. And when I do a lot of work in Rwanda, where 10% of the people were killed in 90 days in 1994, mostly by machetes in a horrible genocide. And they're amazing people. They figured out a way to begin again, and it's working. When Hillary and I first went there in 98 and met with all these survivors of the violence, their per capita income in Rwanda was still $268 a year, less than $1 a day. Over the next 10 years, after I left the White House especially, I helped them finish their memorial to the Holocaust. If you ever go to Africa, it's worth going to Kigali just to see it. It's 3 huge crypts cut in the side of a mountain containing the remains of 300,000 people whose loved ones took them there and registered them in a roll of honor. And then there's a beautiful little museum on top. But anyway, let's start in 1998. So they're still living on $1 a day, less. And I told them that Hillary and I would like to meet some survivors of the violence. And they got me 6 people who, against all odds, having suffered unbelievably, were still working for reconciliation and peace. I'll skip to the end. The last woman was this beautifully dressed, dignified woman, I would say in her mid-40s, in the bright dyed colors of the African Lake Country. And she said to me, "I awoke in a pool of my own blood to find my husband and 6 children lying dead around me. And I had always thought my faith was deep, but I screamed out to God in anger that I had been spared. And then I realized I must have survived for some reason, and it couldn't be anything as mean as vengeance, so I do what I can to help us begin again." What she did this woman who had lost all of her children set up a foster care and adoption service. And she took children in, whether they were in her ethnic group or in the children on the other side who were orphaned. And she placed them with reliable families without regard to their ethnic group. I was shocked, and she was radiant. Okay, fast forward, almost 10 years pass. We have finally finished the memorial. My foundation is working there, providing all the AIDS medicine, and eventually we and a foundation called Partners in Health, headed by Dr. Paul Farmer, built out the entire health system of Rwanda, so they now have a national health network for the first time ever. And I went back, and they had finally finished this museum, so I said, I want to go to the museum. And they had this great-looking guy, young man, take me on a tour, and he had a beautiful, beautiful suit and beautiful smile and really articulate. He looked like he had an MBA from Harvard or something. And he's taken me through the museum, which clinically talks about how the presidents of Rwanda and Burundi were shot down on an airplane and killed, and how the ethnic tensions were inflamed, and how they started killing each other, and how it was all over in 90 days. And we get about 10 minutes into this, and I said, did you lose anybody? He said, yes. He said, my mother, my father, my brother, my sister-in-law. He said, well, if you stop at my uncles, aunts, and first cousins, I lost 73 people in my family. And I said, this must be really hard on you. And he smiled, and he said, no, this is therapeutic. He said, our president says we have to face the truth about what happened to us so that we can let it go. And I said, you remind me of a woman I met here almost 10 years ago. And I told him the story of the woman, the 6 children. And he got a huge smile on his face. He said, I should remind you of her. She is my aunt. And I tell you that not to ease the pain of all the 150 or so families here for whom it is as raw as yesterday, but to remind you that the way you responded was like a ripple in the ocean of hope to give people the strength they need to carry on, and you have brothers and sisters in spirit. As many of you know, I now work in Haiti, and I went there before the earthquake to help as a United Nations Special Representative because they lost 15% of their income from 4 hurricanes 2 years ago before they lost 70% of their income from this horrible earthquake. And before all of it happened, Haiti was still the poorest country in the hemisphere, and 85% of the homes had no electricity. They have been abused and neglected, and they have abused themselves. They have suffered from bad government and rapacious overutilization of their natural resources and all kinds of problems. But they are an amazing people. They're like the Palestinians in that most of the poor Haitians are in Haiti. Once they get out, they do great. In the United States, fewer than 2% of African Americans are Haitians. 11% of African American doctors are Haitian. They are accountants and engineers, and they do unbelievable things, and they have a great culture. And just when you think you got it figured out, you learn that the chief priest of voodoo, a 78-year-old man named Max Beauvoir, worked his way through City College of New York more than 50 years ago and got a scholarship and did graduate work at the Sorbonne in Paris. Was a self-made millionaire and had a chemical business before his grandfather sent for him and asked him to practice and honor the faith of his family because the grandfather was on the deathbed and only he could do it. Just when you think you got it figured out. So anyway, Hillary and I went to Haiti in December of 1975. 2 months married. A friend of us gave us a delayed wedding trip. They said, what do you want? I said, I want to see the people and I want to understand voodoo before I leave. So this young man who worked for Citibank took Hillary and me out. He said, you have to give it all afternoon. He said, this is not some freak show if you want to learn it. I said, we do. And he took me to see this amazing man named Max Beauvoir and his French wife and his 2 children. 35 years later, I show up for the UN, and in the words of the president of Haiti, your old buddy Max is now the Pope of Voodoo. His wife is still living. One of his daughters has passed away. The other one is a professor at the university there. But after all this death, keep in mind they had 220 or 30,000 people died. The first few nights, they had no electricity. People were stumbling over bodies, dead and alive. They didn't know what was going to happen. So, the second or third time I went back, but shortly after the earthquake, I saw the first sign of beginning again, the equivalent of your tree. Anybody that's ever been to Haiti knows that the artists in the street are a big part of the life. They sell paintings, they sell carvings, they do little stonework. And there is, on the way in from the airport to Port-au-Prince, an area with two kind of wrought iron gates on each side of the street where the Haitian artists put up their pictures. And then on one side, there's a whole park, and in normal times, over 100 artists are in that park. So you'll have like 30 or 40 demonstrating their paintings on the street and the rest in the park. So we got there, and about 8 of them had come out. And I said, stop the motorcade. Everybody from the UN gets out. Everybody buys at least one picture, and nobody haggles over the price. Because they were so brave to begin again. And I bought something from 3 different painters, and this one guy started saying, you got to buy something from me. We've got a picture together. And I looked at this guy, and I recognized him in 2002 when I went down there to start my AIDS program. I had stopped and, in fact, bought a painting for him, and, in fact, we had taken a picture. So we're taking a picture, and I said, boy, I really admire you for having the courage to come out here and start again. He said, you shouldn't. It requires no courage on my part. I have nothing else to do. My wife and all my children were killed. But he said, you know, this is the only way I can honor them. Because we artists, we're just a little family. We all know each other. They all know what I lost. And they think if I can come, then they can too. He is your brother in spirit. I wasn't the only person who told you over and over again that in countless ways, large and small, the legacy of those we lost would be in your lives. In the memorial, the museum, and that beautiful tree that you may someday now have to actually prune again. They live on. In every act of kindness or concern from everybody who's ever been touched, every time somebody steps back from saying something they would have said or doing something they would have done, had it not been for you and the power of your example, they live on. I may be one of the more well-known Americans who was changed forever by Oklahoma City, but I am just one of millions. Thank you, and God bless you all.